No other time in the building history do we have a better understanding of what we built and what we can build. Home Building Crossroad can be a way for people to understand that our goal is to put a house in a position for success.
Welcome, everybody, to the UnBuild It podcast. We're here broadcasting live from the UnBuild It studio. I'm your host, Peter Yost, and my good friend, Jake Bruton. And
Sorry,
Steve,
welcome. I'm waving. People might be listening to this in podcast format instead of on YouTube, so I waved if you're just listening.
It was a nice little wave. But it's just Jake and me because Steve is on a Jake and Peter imposed sabbatical. I think that's the best way to say it.
And might be the politest way to say it.
Today's episode is called Homes in Which Jake Has Lived.
Which sounds super pretentious, just so we're clear.
And there's got to be something really compelling about all the different places you have lived. So let's just get to it. Let's start with the first place that Jake lived.
After the hospital.
After the hospital.
Okay. So if you don't know, I am a second generation builder. And so my father was interested in high performance building. He was interested in doing things, quote, the right way. And so we had a variety of homes growing up that all had their own, sort of intricacies or interesting nature.
And let's just be clear, none of these were parsonages.
Yeah, correct.
Okay.
It's parsonage free.
Because that would be
past.
homes in which Peter has lived.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the first house that I lived in from, birth to 5 years old, kindergarten, or maybe a little longer than that actually, was a split level. Mm-hmm. On your neck of the woods, I think they call it a raised ranch.
Yeah.
I think both are still disgusting terms for houses because the house that it describes is disgusting.
As opposed to the depressed ranch?
Yeah, exactly. But the interesting thing was my dad worked at a lumberyard when he did it, and it was the first house that he had built for himself, and he didn't know how to pour concrete. And he didn't want to pay someone to pour concrete, so he built a all-weather wood foundation.
Oh, because it was wood. Yeah.
And he could do that. Compacting stone, all that kind of. So if you're not familiar, and maybe we should do a whole podcast on all-weather wood foundations, because it's pretty interesting. It is. There is a prescribed method that's code approved to build a wood foundation house. The way that he did it, and the reason I use the term all-weather wood foundation, because there was like a certified body that had named it that at that point. They don't call it that anymore. I think it's a permanent wood foundation is what it's called by the code now.
Interesting.
It's compacted aggregate, so 1 inch clean stone, 12 inches thick and compacted, and 24 inches wide. So
and that's the footer.
That's the footing and everything underneath the slab. So he did pour an interior slab after framing the outside, but
flat work's quite different
easier.
Than pouring walls. Yeah.
And then a 2x12 pressure treated, 0.6 rated, so it's ground contact, and then just regular frame walls on top of that, and it had 0.6 rated plywood, 3/4 plywood on the outside.
Yep.
Tar. And while the tar was still wet, 6 mil poly that was pushed into it.
Oh, I did.
And then tarred over the seams, and then backfilled almost entirely with gravel.
So isn't there a chemical interaction between the poly and the asphalt?
Probably, but nobody at that point even,
Probably, but it might not have been a bad thing, right?
These crazy guys that are putting wood foundations in the ground. So the really interesting thing that I think is like, I lived in multiple houses that my parents built, and then houses since then that were built by other people. That basement was the only dry basement I've ever lived in. And it's because he was that much more concerned about moisture at the time that he backfilled 2 feet wide all the way within like a foot of grade with gravel, with stone.
That is so fascinating. So because he was building with wood, he was actually more conscious of moisture below grade than if he'd been using concrete.
Yep. And maybe it's because it was his first endeavor into putting a basement in the ground, But he built the house in 78, I think. And there was no inspection in the county at the time. There was no recourse. It was show up and build a house, which there are some counties that join us still that are the same way. But one of the interesting things is it took them 5 years to sell it. Nobody wanted to buy it.
Because of the basement
Because it had
foundation.
a wood foundation in it, and people didn't think it was going to work. Now, I drove past it in the last 6 months. It's still there. It appears to be very well maintained still. It's pretty. It had a fresh coat of paint on it, some new landscaping. Like, it's still there. Now, it was a walkout. It wasn't a pit.
Oh.
And it was a raised ranch, so there was only 5 or 6 feet worth of foundation in the ground.
Oh, I see.
And because it was a walkout, the drain tile all went to daylight as well. So it was a perfect opportunity for success for an all-weather wood foundation at the time. Like, it's partially in the ground, it's got a walkout, it's free on one side. He did that foot of stone under the whole thing, so anything that got around the perimeter could just drain underneath as well. Because, you know, in a traditional foundation like we put in, there's a footing there that is like a barrier between the two because we don't put stone under the footing. So it's pretty interesting.
And, you know, I was thinking through the details as you were talking, and I guess what you could do is pour the slab as the base for your concrete, for your 2x12 first plate, right? But that's not the way they do it. They that the flat work comes in afterwards.
Yep, after the fact. And so they put a 2x6 around the entire interior and then poured up to that 2x6. And then they rocked, and then we had base trim with big fat base shoe on the inside.
So it was a finished basement.
Yeah, partially finished. Actually, it was half garage, half finished, and it was always uncomfortable in the basement there because the garage wall didn't have any insulation, and then it was just a dirty aluminum door between the outside and the inside.
And so did the foundation wall have insulation
In the perimeter, yeah.
in the perimeter, regardless of whether it was an above grade portion of it or not? Mm-hmm. Fiberglass bat in there.
Yep.
And gypsum wallboard on the
Yep.
interior? Wow. You know, the Forest Products Lab in Madison, Wisconsin built their own research house with an all-weather wood foundation. And there's a report that you can download about, you know, how it went, how they detailed it, but also they did moisture measurements over a longer period of time.
Yep. And I think, and it may not have been that one, but I think Forest Products also had to relocate that house.
Could
and
be.
Moved it and put the same wood back in. They didn't put a new wood foundation under it.
They just reused
They
it.
literally took it apart and then reinstalled it.
I hadn't heard that.
And maybe it's not Forest Products. Maybe it's the people that helped with the all-weather wood foundation to begin with. But like the first one that anybody had done in the United States was relocated, and they didn't have to replace anything even after they moved it.
So in terms of advantages, first of all, carpenters like wood,
Yep.
and it's code approved.
Yep.
You don't have to worry about how cold it is when you're building out of pressure treated instead of cast and concrete.
Yep. Tar is your only limiting factor there,
Yeah, yeah.
or whatever you're going to rub on there. And we kill the worst part of the house for carbon.
Right.
Carbon impact, concrete's one of the absolute worst things that you can use. It is a global warming potential number that's through the roof.
Right.
And the more concrete that we can eliminate, just like Steve and I did the slabless slab house where we did have a concrete wall, but then no concrete slab, anytime you can eliminate the concrete, it's not a bad idea.
So I think we agreed that we weren't going to talk about houses in which I've lived. But the first house I lived in working for the NHP Research Center was a research home that had an all-weather wood foundation.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah. And
You played that one close to the chest so you could bring it up while we were...
actually, I hadn't really thought about it until just now. But, yeah, I mean, it worked just fine. And as far as I know, that house is still standing as well. You need to get back into two of these houses, though.
I
Without
think it would
breaking
be...
and entering. But.
Yeah. Well, I don't mind breaking it. So after
good
it took
start,
them,
Jake.
after it took them 5 years to sell that house, my dad built our next house, and our next house was a concrete basement, full pit basement, multi-level because that was still popular at the time. I think there were 4 different elevations in that house. So literally, if you wanted to go to another room, it involved steps. Pretty much. Like you could use the living room and the bathroom on the main level without having steps, but if you wanted to go to the garage, it was steps. If you wanted to go to the deck, it was steps. Dining room, it was steps. Kitchen, it was steps. And then all the bedrooms were up 2 more flights. Like
Universal design?
Yeah. It was the opposite of universal design. But he wanted to be energy efficient. And so he did a double 2x4 wall.
Oh, really? What year was this?
This would have been 87.
That's funny.
88. And the interesting thing that I remember, we lived in that house until I was probably 12, somewhere around there. And I remember helping hang pictures in that house. And it was a nightmare because everything was 2 foot on center.
Yeah.
Which at that time, if you did that in our market, it was because you were cheaping out. You were trying to cut money. You weren't trying to do a better house. You weren't trying for more insulation. But the first wall that got framed, the exterior wall, was regular, traditional 2x4 frame, double top plate, all that. The inboard wall of that...
24 in center or 16?
Yep.
24?
24. The inboard wall of that, everything ran horizontally on 2 foot centers. So if you wanted to mount something to the wall and it needed framing, it had to hang at 4 foot or 6 foot off the ground, and that was it.
But at least you could put it anywhere you wanted.
You could put it anywhere on the wall you wanted, as long as it was 6 feet from the ground. And I remember there being pictures like in one long run in one of the formal, the fancy people.
So did he do it with a space between the two?
No, so he just used gutter spikes driven through 2x4s to hold that second layer on.
And was the load bearing both of them or the outside?
I think it was just the outside. Yeah, if I remember correctly, that there was.
That would make sense.
There's no verticals at all in that inner layer. But that house still stands as well, and my dad still claims to this day that was the lowest energy bills of any house that he had built. That one was very modest and very well taken care of, and not to crap on my dad, but I remember more than once that there was water in the basement at that house. And so like these decisions that he made in the process, and these decisions things that I grew up with, seeing my dad make what I thought were mistakes, or which were possibly mistakes, guide some of the things that we think about today. Like, I don't think that I would build an in-ground basement foundation without some really serious waterproofing. Like if I had a client say, yeah, we don't want to spend that money down there, we'd rather have nicer countertops, I'd say, I'm not your builder. Like, I'm not going to be the one to make you a leaky basement. Sorry.
So we said we were only going to talk about homes that Jake built, but
I like this theme already.
My brother, Izzy, one of my brothers that was a builder, in 1984, we built a double wall house for him, so about the same era as your dad. And we did it with double stud wall, but it was 3.5 inches gap between the outer and the inner wall. So he ran vertical fiberglass in the outside wall, crisscross horizontally in the space between, and then vertical on the inside wall. So it was an 11 1/4. 3 times 3.5 is what, 10.5 inches, I guess, deep. And interestingly, I've always given him a ration of grief because I said, that's an awful deep air permeable wall assembly. And you probably have moisture problems on your outside, on your sheathing because it's so cold. And he said, no, we had a vapor retarder. We used 6 mil poly. Mm-hmm. Well, probably a pretty good thing that we did use 6 mil poly because
it's an air barrier, not a vapor retarder.
Well, and he hadn't detailed it as an air barrier, but at least it was keeping wintertime moisture out of the wall, except where there was air leakage. But we've both blower door tested at home, and I've also done pin extension moisture readings on the north wall. And it's kind of damp in the end of March, but when I come back to the same pinholes and measure in September, it's bone dry. So it's getting wet.
But it's drying, and that's the only thing that's important.
Yeah.
So after that house, they bought the lot across the street, and he built the house across the street and put them both up for sale. And we moved to the new house because the older one sold quicker. And that house was, again, a walkout, and it was like the builder that's successful. It was, we have a 4,000 square foot house with everybody. We have a playroom for the kids, and we have 2 dining rooms, and we have, and it was a 2x6 wall energy hog that... I take that back. It wasn't a walkout. The back wall of the foundation was 4 feet tall, and the other walls were 8. So we had windows on the back wall, the back face of the house. So it was kind of almost like a walkout, just not excavated that much. And when I talked to my dad about that house, he talks about it as being like not the mistake, but the one that got the least amount of consideration out of all the ones that he built for himself, because it was like, we're making good money, we have a successful company, we should build our dream house. And our dream house had to do with square footage and not with energy goals. And all the other houses that he had built had these other goals that guided where the house went, not necessarily how many Christmas trees my mother wanted to buy or how tall of a Christmas tree that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think that there's nothing spectacular about the house. It was a well-built house. There was nothing wrong with it. I mean, it was very competitive with anything else in the market at the time. But I think that conversation is like I feel like generations after generations go through that. Like, we got the money now, let's get the house that we've always dreamed that we would have. And that dream that we have is just about square footage.
It's really interesting, too, how it shifted as you built each house. Mm-hmm. And this is through your filter, so there are things that you remember about each of the projects.
Yeah. And that house, I was old enough that I wasn't quite old enough to help for real, but I was there some. And that was the first job site that I got to spend a ton of time on, where we had a huge pile of dirt from that basement in the front yard, and I dug holes in it that were big enough to climb in, and that greatly influenced me wanting to be on job sites from there on. Even though 2 or 3 years later, when I was working for him, I no longer wanted to play in the dirt like a little kid, that sort of thing. So then when I was 16, he put that house up for sale, and we built one across the street, we built one across the street, and we put them both up for sale.
Yep.
And the one across the street was substantially smaller. So they were a single kid household at that point. Older sibling had moved out. And we did a turn down slab with 2x6 walls and what we thought were good quality vinyl windows, which I think is now an oxymoron in my mind, like good quality vinyl windows. But we had 6 mil poly on the inside. We had R48, I think, in the attic.
Wow.
And this is 97, somewhere in there, very forward thinking. We should put more insulation up there.
And was that fiberglass?
I think it was blown in fiberglass at that time. Yeah, if I remember correctly. And then that turned down slab in an effort to try to not be cold, because that was the first slab house that we lived in since I was little, since the wood foundation house. We insulated the outside of the slab. So we dug down about 10 inches below grade, or before we backfilled. We put in XPS on the outside of the foundation with big washers and the ramset gun. And then we took brake metal like we would bend for soffit work, and we bent a cover that went over that and just tucked it into the dirt and then pushed the dirt back up against the house. And the house had this white water table look where you couldn't see the foundation at all. It went down. So the
bent metal was white.
Yeah. And it was a pretty house. I remember when they put them both up for sale and they decided to move to the little one because the big one was selling, again, across the street. Literally 3 houses that shared property lines is what I lived in growing up. My dad pulled his truck over there and tried to pull it into the garage, and it wouldn't go into the garage because he'd done an arch on the top of the garage door and his truck was too tall. So we had a 16-foot wide garage door and then an 8-foot wide garage door next to it, and the 8-foot wide garage door was squared off, and the 16-foot had an arch in it still because my mother's car would fit into that side. That was my first memory of we moved into that house, and the first thing he and I did was take it apart and fix something on it. But the interesting thing about the foundation detail on that one that I bet you remember that we've talked about before is when he went to sell that house a few years ago, and the house is 15 years old, 20 years old, the inspector said, I can't inspect the foundation. All that white stuff and whatever's behind it has to come off. Otherwise, I can't sign off on the foundation. And they were like, well, it's a half day to rip all that stuff off there. Walk around with a knife, cut that metal off, bend it, let it, and then throw all that stuff away. So they agreed to do it. They pulled it all off, and the XPS was full of holes big enough for mice to run through, and snake skins and bugs and all this stuff. And there had been burrowing animals and insects and vermin of all sorts finding their way into that and deleting that insulation, basically.
Now, Jake, I think what we can refer to is the effective R value. Because if the insulation, which has an R value, is displaced by mammals, and they're homeostatic, which means they hold a steady temperature, there's the contributory R value of the animals and their metabolic rate.
Well, until we talk about reptilian inhabitants, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they definitely screw up your R value.
That cold-blooded snake doesn't help with your... You didn't think I was going to have a smart-ass response to that, did
I
you?
knew you'd raise to the occasion.
But that house then dictates the fact that I'm adamant that I'm not putting insulation on the outside of the foundation.
Yeah.
There's like all these little bitty lessons, from water management to you can get a wild hair up your butt and decide to do a double stud wall, but you better think about why you're doing it. Steve always says you got to ask the right question sort of stuff.
Yeah.
We just built the house of our dreams, and the house of our dreams was nothing but square footage requirements or ceiling heights. I remember that was the first time that we'd lived in a house that didn't just have 8-foot ceilings.
Yeah.
And then even trying to do things the right way, we definitely still screwed stuff up,
Did your dad listen to the UnBuild podcast?
I don't think so. I'm going to hope he doesn't. They were all well-built houses.
Yeah, you're
I'm
not dissing
filtering them through I look for the thing that I did wrong with my own business, so that I look at the thing that other people do wrong. But it was a learning experience that I didn't know was a learning experience at the time. And it was really interesting to figure out a bunch of stuff about building science and then go back and talk to my dad about them and have him go, wow, we just didn't want to pay as much for energy. Well, the mortgage on that house was 18%, so we knew that we didn't want to, and it's just like, oh, there's all these other choices that I don't see and I don't understand because I didn't live through that part or I wasn't aware at that time.
Yeah.
So,
are we up to current speed now on all the homes in which Jeff has lived?
So that is all the homes that my father built. Mm-hmm. I bought a 60s ranch after college that had a pit basement. And the only really big thing that I learned from that one, besides the fact that yet another basement was not dry, was I lived there when I bought my first blower door.
Oh.
And I blower door tested that house while my parents still lived in that ranch that we were just talking about with the turned down slab. And they were effectively both 7.5 ACH 50. Wow. So from 1965 to 1997, we hadn't gotten any better at air sealing. That's interesting. And that was like an epiphany for me. And then I started playing with the vinyl windows in the newer house and those sorts of things. So I was just cross-referencing again.
So you bought a blower door pretty early in your...
Yeah, 2013, 2014, somewhere in there. And I realized that in remodeling that 60s ranch, the only walls in the house that had insulation in them also were wet walls or walls that were next to the bathroom or the kitchen. And they had R7 fiberglass in them. And I'd never even seen R7 fiberglass.
And is that the stuff you just look at it?
Yeah.
That is nasty.
Like you could clap your hands on it and it would just turn to dust and fly away sort of thing.
That's really nasty.
Like paper that's been through a fire but didn't burn all the way up sort of stuff. Yeah. And then and then we talk about our Spring Valley Aero project that my wife and I built that's R40 walls, triple glazed windows from Europe, R80 attic insulation, and 0.43 ACH 50. And I can now say that very well air sealed, insulated, and high quality windows, a really good envelope, in other words, gives me a quiet house. I sleep better here. I don't hear the neighbor's dogs barking. And it's the most comfortable property that I've ever lived in. And I never understood that those other ones were uncomfortable until I lived here.
So when did you decide that you were going to take the business from your dad?
So he kind of suckered me into coming back for one project. I was making a living as an artist, and then he basically just said, "Hey, that went really well. I'm going to sell the business to somebody that works for me." And I was like, "Oh, I'm the only employee." Oh, okay. And I thought like, I can put what I was doing on hold and see if I like this. And really, immediately I was like, oh, being my own boss and getting to build stuff, which is an incredibly rewarding thing, that be able to walk away from it every day and know and see what you created, sort of thing, was immediately rewarding as being an artist. And I was just like, okay, this is what I can do. And then it still took me years to figure out that I was worried about water or air or getting sued, or doing things wrong. So it was kind of like I'm going to be done with the business, but I didn't know how to tell you this sort of thing.
Sounds like your dad is a pretty smart guy.
I think he doesn't let on as smart as what he is sometimes. Even I think he definitely played me on that one, and I didn't see it coming at all. So, but I thought that this was a good conversation to just be like, oh, look at all this little history of things that influence the way we build now, and ideas that I have, and that sort of stuff, and like all those houses that I live in now or have lived in affect every conversation I have with Steve about what we're doing for clients.
Yeah. It's kind of cool, too, that you can look back, because most of us can't look back through the homes that we live in because our dads didn't build them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Very cool. Well, you have just unbuilt all of the homes in which Jake has lived.
Again, it still doesn't sound any less pretentious when we just put that as the... So, thanks for watching on YouTube today. Thanks for listening on the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe. Hit the little bell button so you get notifications every time we publish. If you're on the podcast, please go to iTunes. Leave us a 5-star review. Please, please, please tell us what you like and what you don't like. We're willing to change things or explore content that you're interested in. We still are enjoying this greatly and having a blast doing this. So we're thankful for you guys and thankful for our sponsors. Say goodbye, Pete.
Bye, Pete.
Thanks.